Hi there, Ronnie here, coming at you with a video. I think I'm cursed. I did a video earlier on. Apparently the sound cut out midway through, so I had to get rid of that. Tried to re-record it, sound cut out on this, so I'm hoping third time's a charm. It's October 30th. 'Tis the night before Halloween. And gamer that I am always thinking about games to run, or horror games at this time of year. I had intended on running a little one-shot sort of gothic horror, Victorian horror at my friendly local gaming store. However, recent events have caused me to postpone my gaming, my RPG gaming that is, there for a wee while. And I've been doing a lot of board gaming during the week, and playing lots of board games. Last year I did do a two-part review overview of my board games. Go back and check them out. That was pretty much all the horror ones I had at that point. I have since added to that, mostly thanks to my friend Caroline, who gave me the game Unfathomable for my birthday. Hope to get that on table soon. But board games is not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about RPGs, and more importantly, horror. I'm on record in saying that I believe that horror is, by a country mile, the most difficult genre or style of game to run. And the reason I say style rather than genre, because you can do horror in sci-fi, you can do horror in fantasy, you can do horror modern day. And the reason I think it's so difficult is twofold. One, what scares one person doesn't necessarily scare someone else. And two, well, I mean, the example of one, I remember years and years and years ago watching the original Nightmare on Elm Street, getting the shit scared out of me. To the point where I have never watched that nor any of its sequels. Am I too much of a nervous Nelly for films like that? Yeah, but still. My Fiona and Maxine watched it and couldn't understand where the hell I was coming from. I couldn't understand what on earth I found scary about it. Well, there you go. I think the second reason is that it places far more emphasis on description than any other style of game. And whilst every RPG requires the GM to go into full narration mode and really describe what the players are saying, with horror you've got to do more than just describe. You've got to describe it in a way that elicits a very strong, visceral, intense emotional reaction, namely fear, dread. Difficult to do. In fact, the only thing I think is possibly as difficult to do is romance. For similar reasons, actually, because you're trying to elicit an emotional reaction. Now, I'm not saying that you know, your romance games are difficult because they fill the players with dread. Possibly, depends on your players. The idea of romance might fill them with dread, but as a rule, they don't. Sorry, yawning. It's getting late on. I find horror extremely difficult for that reason. When I started, first horror games I ran, I was using, I mean, there was 2 games I had. I had Call of Cthulhu, 4th edition. Simply because that was the edition that was out when I bought it. And I had a game by a games designer workshop called Dark Conspiracy. I think I ran maybe 1 or 2 games of that, to be honest. I was never a big fan of it. Ran a few more of Cthulhu. I still have my copy of 4th edition Cthulhu, actually. Which is more than can be said for Dark Conspiracy. I got rid of that when I moved to Wishaw. But I was never, I think because I'm not a big horror film fan, I don't really watch horror. I don't watch horror TV shows. I'm not big on horror novels or anything like that. And because of that, I was never really that good at running horrors. Back in those days, I mean, I was going for broad strokes and blood and gore and things like that, and it really, my games were pretty pathetic. Then I got 1st edition of Cult, and I was a lot older by then, and I found that Cult just hit the spot for me. Because suddenly it was dealing with a style of horror that I actually could relate to. And that is not horror of existential dread or eldritch, sort of eldritch things. It was dealing with the internal, the horror of the soul, the yin and yang of one's personality, and that sort of drive within, with the darkness coming out. The other thing that started happening is I was interested in sort of films about serial killers, and not films about them as in true life tales or anything like that, or films where the serial killer was the main character. More of that in a minute. But about the psychology of catching them. I found the idea of psychological profiling very interesting, and I loved Silence of the Lambs, Manhunter. I think Seven probably had its biggest impact with me. But other films, as I say, I'm not a big horror watcher. Alien obviously is a huge influence. Angel Heart is a big influence. Jacob's Ladder. Martin Scorsese's remake of Cape Fear, which I still think is one of the most intense psychological sort of horror thrillers out there. Robert De Niro's performance in that is extraordinary. Absolutely terrifying. And later on, watching shows like Criminal Minds and The Inside, and as much as some people don't like it, Hannibal. But what I found was, if you take something every day, and I'm not saying killing is every day, but when you remove the supernatural or the extra dimensional, extraterrestrial, when you remove all of that, you're dealing with human beings, which are by far and away the biggest monsters out there. One could argue that all the sort of stories of the supernatural are merely taking the extremes of aberrant human behavior and giving it a form, which is something that cult is very good at, sort of realizing and visualizing. The idea that those kind of horrors that you see are essentially manifestations of your own darkness, or manifestations of humanity's darkness. There's, you can argue whether or not they exist because of humanity's darkness, or whether humanity's darkness exists because of these manifestations. But it means that everything is internal rather than external horror, right? It's all about the horror within. The horror of the soul. And I find that far more interesting than sort of blood and guts and viscera. I find hunting for humanity in someone and finding only horror to be very interesting. I mean, there's a very interesting, sort of very low-key horror film from 1980 called The Changeling, with George C. Scott. And he plays a composer who has moved into a new house. Well, it's an old building, but he's moved in there recently. And he's a widow. He watched on helplessly as his wife and child are involved in an accident, and they're killed. And he's obviously still grieving. And strange things are happening in the house, the usual things, doors opening and closing, noises and so on. And it's interesting that it takes its time about things, because it's going for atmosphere. It's very low key, where something like a ball bouncing down steps, or a child's wheelchair moving of its own accord, is something terrifying, because it's out of place. And ultimately, it's the ghost of a child that's haunting this place. And the point of it that's interesting is, would that ghost have manifested regardless of whether that, whoever had moved in? Or did that ghost sense something in this man that it either repulsed him, and this is a reaction to that repulsion, or does it sense something of a kindred spirit in sensing this man's grief and his pain? And I find that much more interesting in terms of a story than, you know, things that go bump in the night and things that, you know, causing all kinds of nastiness. I mean, I can't watch a lot of like slasher pics and torture porn because I just the things that horrify me are things like just sadism and sort of cruelty. I find those things a big turn off, and I just can't watch them. So there's that. But because I don't like the kind of brutality and that kind of violence and everything, I tend to stay away from a lot of horror, and I find the horror of human beings and how just downright vile we can be to each other to be far more interesting and horrific. I mean, the obviously the ghost of a child, yes, that can be terrifying. And it can be, and where you film it and how you place the scenes and tension and everything, you create that. But how that child died, that's the horror for me. That hits me in a instinctual place. I don't like it. I watched yesterday. I watched all 6 episodes in one go on Amazon Prime. I don't know if it's on Prime everywhere. It's certainly here in the UK. Is a show called The Devil's Hour with Peter Capaldi, and I found that fascinating. I mean, the first couple of episodes was just so many different strands that weren't connecting, and yet slowly they began to sort of coalesce. And by the final episode, you kind of you get the big reveal and everything, and you learn what's going on. And some of it's downright creepy, both in terms of what led up to that, and then the reveal leads. You know, it's quite disturbing as well. I don't want to spoil anything. If you're able to watch it, please do. It's very enjoyable. But I enjoyed it thoroughly. It's really well done. It's fantastic. And I you know, full marks to them for coming up with it. It was an interesting premise. So yes, I do think that horror is the most difficult style of game to GM. I think it can be the most rewarding if you pull it off. I certainly would never recommend a GM start with horror. Do something else. Learn description and build yourself up for horror. But don't be afraid to try it. By all means, go for a halfway house if you want, and do something in the action horror genre. This things like the Resident Evil movies, because I know the video games are very different. The Resident Evil movies, or the Underworld movies, which I think are phenomenally fun. You know, you're not going to win any Oscars, but they're just damn fun. It's worth it if you get it right. But if you don't, learn from it, as we often do with GMing games. Learn from it, build on it, and make the next one better. And just enjoy yourself. And don't be afraid to bring in elements of the mundane horror, because they can really work as long as you do it properly, do it with some taste and tact. You can really hit people hard right there, which is what you're going for. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back soon with another video.